On May 26, 2026, a semiconductor company headquartered in Boise, Idaho, hit a market capitalization of $1 trillion. That company, Micron Technology, had been founded 48 years earlier in the basement of a dental office by 4 engineers who'd just been laid off, with $300,000 scraped together from local investors who knew nothing whatsoever about computer chips. The man who saved that company from bankruptcy was a potato farmer, and the city where all of this happened, Boise, had a population of 995 people in 1870, not 99,000. 995. This is the story of how a place with no railroad, no gold, no navigable river, and no earthly reason to become anything at all became one of the most consequential cities in modern American technology. It is also the story of hot water, literal hot water, flowing under the ground, and what happens when a city keeps discovering that the most valuable thing about it is something nobody can see. Gold started the whole improbable chain. In August 1862, a prospector named George Grimes, inspired by a native story of gold you could scoop up by the handful, led a party from Walla Walla into the mountains of what would soon become Idaho Territory. They found it, rich placer deposits, thick in the Crete gravels, 25 miles northeast of where Boise would eventually stand. Within days of the discovery, Grimes was dead, killed either by a rival prospector or by indigenous people defending their land, depending on which account you believe. But the gold didn't care who found it. By December 1862, a full-blown rush was underway. Miners poured in by the thousands, up the Columbia River to Umatilla, then overland by stage and pack train. By the fall of 1863, the Boise Basin had a population estimated between 16,000 and 25,000 people, and Idaho City, the rough hub of the diggings, had briefly surpassed Portland in size, making it the largest settlement in the entire Pacific Northwest. The Boise Basin would ultimately yield over 2.8 million ounces of gold. Between 1863 and 1896 alone, the Idaho City camp produced gold valued at nearly $45 million, an enormous sum when a working man's daily wage was $1 or $2. A hard-working miner in a good spot could take $8 to $20 a day from the gravels, and the luckiest pulled 100. The basin produced more gold than the whole of Alaska, or so the old boosters like to claim, and while that figure is disputed, the scale was staggering. But here is the first thing to understand about Boise. The gold was not in Boise. The gold was in the mountains, 25 miles away. Boise existed because a small group of businessmen, merchants, not miners, recognized that thousands of men scrambling through mountain creeks needed somewhere to buy supplies, stable horses, eat a meal, mail a letter. On July 7, 1863, those businessmen met and laid out a town they called Boise City, 10 blocks along what is now Main Street between 5th and 10th. They set aside plots for public buildings. They chose a spot in the flat valley along the Boise River, near a new U.S. Army post called Fort Boise, which had been established to protect settlers and keep order in the territory. The town was not built on a resource. It was built on a bet that geography and commerce would matter more than geology. The miners would dig the gold. Boise would sell them shovels. That bet paid off almost immediately. In 1864, the territorial legislature moved the capital from Lewiston, hundreds of miles north, down to Boise. The vote was essentially a matter of population arithmetic. The mining rush had shifted the territory's center of gravity south, and the miners and the merchants who fed them now outnumbered the old Lewiston establishment. It was, by every account, a contentious decision. Lewiston didn't give up the territorial seal without a fight, and legend has it the documents had to be physically carried south under armed escort. But the capital stuck. Boise, barely a year old, was now the seat of government for an area that stretched, in those early days, across much of what would become Montana and Wyoming. Then the gold began to thin. Not overnight. The Basin's deposits were deep enough that mining continued for decades. But the first wild rush, the one that had created Idaho City and Pioneerville and Placerville almost overnight, started winding down by the late 1860s. Miners drifted out. The population of the territory fell. In the 1870 census, Boise recorded just 995 people. The mining camps that had dwarfed Portland were turning into half-empty collections of wooden buildings and rusting sluice equipment. And now the second blow, the Transcontinental Railroad, or more precisely, the Oregon Short Line, the Union Pacific subsidiary that was building westward across southern Idaho, came through in the early 1880s, laying track from Wyoming toward Oregon. The main line ran through the flat Snake River Plain. It passed through Shoshone, Pocatello, and in 1883, a brand new junction point called Nampa, 20 miles west of Boise. The railroad did not come to Boise. The capital city of Idaho Territory, with its government buildings and its merchants and its pretensions to permanence, was simply too far from the natural route across the desert floor. Boise got a stub line, a 19-mile branch track from Nampa, completed in 1887 by the Idaho Central Railway. The first train rolled into Boise on September 5, 1887. It was a branch, a spur. The capital of the territory was at the end of a dead-end track, connected to the transcontinental network only through the courtesy of a junction at a town that hadn't existed 5 years earlier. Think about what this meant in the 1880s and 1890s. The railroad was everything. The difference between a city and a ghost town, between commerce and isolation. Every ambitious western town fought to be on the main line, spent fortunes lobbying, offered free land, tax breaks, anything. Boise had the territorial capital, but Nampa had the railroad. If you were a traveler stepping off the Oregon Short Line at Nampa and looking east, you had to change to a branch train for another 19 miles just to reach the capital. It was an indignity, and it was a genuine economic handicap. Freight cost more. Passengers were less likely to bother. A lesser city would have stalled. Boise did not stall. By 1890, Idaho achieved statehood, the 43rd state admitted on July 3, 1890, and Boise became the permanent state capital. The population crept upward, 2,311 in 1890, then a dramatic leap to 5,957 by 1900. Something was drawing people in despite the stub line. Part of it was government. A state capital generates a certain gravity of its own, with offices and courts and legislators who need hotels and restaurants and law firms. Part of it was agriculture. The Boise Valley, irrigated by the river, was turning out to be remarkably productive farmland, and the Federal Reclamation Act of 1902 would soon pour government money into the irrigation infrastructure that transformed the desert. But part of it was something stranger, something that would become a recurring motif in Boise's history. The discovery that the ground beneath the city was hiding something valuable. In the early 1890s, a banker named C.W. Moore, president of the Boise Artesian Hot and Cold Water Company, made a discovery that would have seemed trivial in most cities, but that altered the physical and economic character of Boise for the next century and beyond. East of downtown, near the old Idaho State Penitentiary, geothermal hot water was bubbling up from deep underground. Not warm water, hot water, 177 degrees Fahrenheit, rising from thousands of feet below the surface, heated by a massive buried formation of ancient igneous rock called the Idaho Batholith. Moore, who had a talent for promotion that rivaled any railroad baron's, did something audacious. He piped the hot water into his own home, a new brick mansion at the corner of Warm Springs Avenue and Walnut Street. In 1892, it became the first house in the United States heated by geothermal energy. Moore wasn't finished. He hired the architect John C. Paulson to design the Boise Natatorium, the Nat, a Moorish revival bathing palace that opened in May 1892. The pool was 125 feet long, one of the largest in the West, kept at a constant 98 degrees by the same underground hot water. A 40-foot artificial waterfall cascaded over a lava rock diving platform. There was a copper slide 2 stories high. Upstairs, a cafe, a saloon, card rooms, a dance floor. The whole thing cost $87,000. A trolley line was built down Warm Springs Avenue to carry patrons from downtown for a nickel. Other affluent Boiseans, persuaded by Moore's demonstration that this hidden heat was reliable, began building homes along Warm Springs Avenue, each one connected to the geothermal system. The Idaho Statesman ran a piece on October 4, 1892, noting that the decision to bring hot water into town is one of the most important steps recently taken here. There is enough to heat the entire city. The entire city. The newspaper was right, though it would take another 90 years for Boise to fully act on it. But the pattern was set. Boise's most important assets were invisible from the surface. Meanwhile, at the corner of 10th and Main, 2 blocks north of the Stub Line's downtown depot, a new building was rising that announced Boise's ambition with a kind of architectural bravado that bordered on defiance. The Idanha Hotel, designed by architect Walter Stewart Campbell, opened on January 1, 1901, the first day of the 20th century. Campbell had toured every major hotel between Boise and New York before settling on a French chateau style that would have looked at home in Montreal or Quebec City. The building was 6 stories of red brick with round turrets on 3 corners capped by steep conical roofs, a mansard roofline, and sandstone trim quarried locally. It was the tallest building in Idaho. It had the state's first elevator. It cost $125,000. $125,000 at the end of a 19-mile branch line in a state capital of fewer than 6,000 people. The Idanha was not a rational investment in any conventional sense. It was a declaration, the kind of building a city erects when it has decided to become something it is not yet. The Idaho Statesman declared its amenities the acme of perfection. Guests over the coming years would include Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, William Jennings Bryan, and, most consequentially, the lawyers who came for the trial that would briefly make Boise the most watched city in America. On the evening of December 30th, 1905, Frank Steunenberg, the former governor of Idaho who had left office 4 years earlier, approached the side gate of his home in Caldwell, about 30 miles west of Boise. He opened the gate. A bomb rigged to the gatepost detonated. The explosion blew Steunenberg 10 feet into the air. He died within hours. The killer was a drifter and career criminal named Harry Orchard, who was arrested the next day at a Caldwell hotel. Under intense interrogation by the Pinkerton detective James McParland, Orchard confessed and then claimed he'd been hired by the leadership of the Western Federation of Miners, the radical labor union that Steunenberg had crushed during the violent Coeur d'Alene mining strikes of 1899 by calling in federal troops and declaring martial law. William Big Bill Haywood, the Union Secretary-Treasurer, was arrested in Denver and extradited to Idaho. The trial, held in Boise from May through July 1907, became a national spectacle. More than 50 journalists from around the country descended on the city. Clarence Darrow, already famous and not yet the legend he would become after the Scopes trial, led the defense. William Borah, soon to be a powerful U.S. Senator from Idaho, helped prosecute. Many of the visiting lawyers and reporter stayed at the Idanha, the only hotel in town grand enough for the occasion. The Idanha's lobby became, for 10 weeks, a kind of informal headquarters for the machinery of American justice and the American press. The jury acquitted Haywood. The case rested almost entirely on Orchard's testimony, and Darrow dismantled the prosecution's reliance on a single, deeply unreliable witness. Haywood walked free. He later fled to Russia to avoid a federal sedition charge and died there in 1928. He is buried at the Kremlin. The trial was the biggest thing that had ever happened to Boise, and arguably the biggest thing that ever would until the tech era. The Ada County Courthouse became the setting for a national drama. Darrow's cross-examination of Orchard lasted days, picking apart a confession that stretched to 64 typewritten pages and implicated the Union leadership in at least 17 murders. The entire proceeding, labor versus capital, the working man versus the mine owner, the radical West versus the genteel East, played out in a courtroom in a city that most of the visiting press corps had never heard of before receiving their assignments. The streets around the courthouse filled with onlookers. Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, publicly called Haywood an undesirable citizen before the verdict was even in, provoking fury from labor sympathizers. Eugene Debs, the socialist leader, declared that if Haywood were convicted, 1 million workers would know what to do. In the end, the jury decided in 2 hours, not guilty. But for Boise, the trial did something simpler and more practical than settle a question of guilt. It put the city on the map. For 10 weeks, readers across the country had followed dispatches dateline from this small western capital, and many of them, for the first time, learned that it existed at all. The city grew. By 1910, the population had nearly tripled to 17,358. The firm of Turtelot and Hummel, John Turtelot, a Connecticut transplant, and Charles Hummel, a German-trained architect who'd come to Boise in 1895 after the Panic of 1893 left him broke in Seattle, was designing buildings across southern Idaho at a pace that bordered on mania. Over the course of their partnership, they would complete more than 900 projects: homes, churches, schools, banks, courthouses. Their masterpiece was the Idaho State Capitol, begun in 1905 and completed in stages through 1920, a neoclassical dome of native sandstone and marble that Turtelot filled with light through carefully placed windows and skylights. The building would later become, like the Victorian homes on Warm Springs Avenue, heated by the hot water beneath the city, making it the only state capitol in America warmed by geothermal energy. And then there was Morrison Knudsen. In 1912, Harry Morrison, an Illinois-born concrete superintendent who'd come to Idaho in 1904 to work on federal water reclamation projects, teamed up with Morris Knudsen, a Danish immigrant known for his skill with horses and dirt scrapers. They formed a construction company with $600 in capital, a few horses, and a dozen wheelbarrows. Their first job was a subcontract at a pumping station along the Snake River near Grandview, roughly $14,000 worth of work. It barely broke even. But Morrison had vision, and Knudsen had endurance, and the federal government's appetite for dams and canals was bottomless. By the 1920s, Morrison Knudsen was winning major contracts across the West. In 1931, as part of the 6 Companies Consortium, they helped build the Hoover Dam, the largest concrete structure on Earth at the time, a $49 million project that employed 5,000 men in the Nevada desert. Morrison Knudsen went on to build the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center, the largest building in the world by volume when it was completed in 1966, and 153 miles of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. A 1954 feature in Time magazine called Harry Morrison, the man who has done more than anyone else to change the face of the earth. His headquarters the whole time remained on the corner of Front and Broadway in Boise, Idaho. Thousands of Boiseans built careers there, spending months in the office drafting plans before being sent into the field, to Brazil, Afghanistan, Portugal, for years at a time. Morrison Knudsen gave Boise something no government contract or railroad spur ever could: the identity of a city that builds things. Not a mining town, not a farm town, not a sleepy state capital. A place where men with wheelbarrows and ambition could build a dam across the Colorado River. At its peak, MK employed 8,500 people and operated in more than 35 countries. The company published a monthly employee magazine called the M. Cayenne that circulated to construction sites on 5 continents. For decades, if you met someone from Boise and asked what they did, the answer was likely to involve Morrison Knudsen. The company's philanthropy shaped the city physically. Anne Morrison Park, commissioned after the death of Harry Morrison's first wife in 1959 and built by MK employees, remains one of downtown Boise's most beloved public spaces. When Anne Morrison died, the company magazine's tribute captured the culture. More than a memory is such a treasured presence as hers, for its truth is timeless, and selfless love is more enduring than even the great dams her people have built. But the population numbers tell an odd story. Between 1920 and 1960, 4 full decades, Boise grew from 21,393 to only 34,481. That's not stagnation exactly, but it's nothing like the explosive growth of western cities like Phoenix or Las Vegas, or even Salt Lake City during the same period. Boise was comfortable, pleasant, safe, and almost entirely unknown. It was the kind of city where people raised children and went to work for the state government, or for Morrison Knudsen, and never felt the need to explain themselves to anyone from out of town. The cultural life had its moments. On April 19, 1927, the Egyptian Theater opened on the corner of Main Street and Capitol Boulevard, a 1,600-seat movie palace in the Egyptian Revival style, inspired by the discovery of King Tut's tomb 5 years earlier. Commissioned by local entrepreneur Leo J. Falk, designed by Frederick Hummel of the Tourtellotte and Hummel successor firm, the theater featured lotus column pillars, gilded hieroglyphic panels, a Robert Morton pipe organ, and a 40-foot proscenium arch. Falk had wanted to bring refinement to a downtown that still carried a whiff of its frontier saloon days. Hummel had pushed for Spanish style. Falk insisted on Egyptian. Falk won, though if you look closely at the roof, you can still see the red Spanish tiles, a trace of the argument frozen in terracotta. The opening night film was John Barrymore in Don Juan. The house was packed. Within decades, the theater would fall into disrepair, passed between operators who let the gilding tarnish and the plaster crack. By the mid-1970s, it was within 30 days of a wrecking ball. A developer named Earl Hardy purchased the building in 1975, but the restoration he dreamed of kept stalling. Then a young man named Thurber and 5 of his high school friends formed a committee. They bought the theater's original pipe organ to keep it from being sold off, and decided that if the Egyptian was going down, it would go down with one last show, a screening of the 1927 Academy Award-winning World War I film, Wings. Someone, Thurber later said it started as a joke, arranged with the local highway district to hang a vintage Sopwith Camel biplane from a crane above the intersection of Main and Capitol Boulevard. The publicity was enormous. The theater was packed. A movement grew. The Egyptian was saved, restored, and eventually returned to something like its original glory. The lotus pillars re-gilded. The original terracotta and blue-green color scheme painstakingly recovered by scraping through layers of later paint. It stands today, the last single-screen theater in downtown Boise, a building that exists because a teenager made a joke about an airplane. Then the 1970s arrived, and 2 things happened that bent the trajectory of the city permanently. The first was almost comically arbitrary. In 1973, Hewlett-Packard, then one of America's preeminent technology companies, decided to establish a new printer division outside of California. Bill Hewlett himself wanted the operation away from the Bay Area's rising costs. A young HP executive named Ray Smellick was tasked with finding the right city. He considered 3, Boise, Spokane, and Corvallis, Oregon. All 3 were, from a business standpoint, essentially interchangeable. no compelling operational reason to choose one over the others. Smellick chose Boise. His reasons, as he later admitted in a memoir, were personal to the point of absurdity. There was a nice golf course, ski passes were cheap, and Idaho's teen driving age of 14 was appealing to his 4 kids, who were 7, 10, 12, and 14. I didn't tell anyone at the time what the truth was about how we site-selected Boise, Smellick wrote. It seemed such a dumb reason. HP's Boise division began operations in September 1973 in an 1,800-square-foot leased space at 105 North 8th Street. Within 2 years, it was earning $20 million in annual revenue. In 1975, HP broke ground on a permanent 154,000-square-foot plant on 150 acres of farmland just west of the city limits. And in 1984, the Boise team introduced the HP LaserJet printer, a product that would become arguably the most successful single product in Hewlett-Packard's long history. During the turbulent 1990s, when virtually every other division of HP was struggling, the Boise-based LaserJet operation generated some 70% of the company's total profits and nearly all of its growth. HP board members called Boise the lifeboat of HP. An entire technology ecosystem, engineers, managers, marketers, supply chain specialists, had taken root in the Treasure Valley because one man liked the golf. The second thing that happened in the 1970s was quieter, stranger, and ultimately far larger. In October 1978, 4 semiconductor engineers, Ward Parkinson, his twin brother Joe Parkinson, a corporate lawyer, not an engineer, Dennis Wilson, and Doug Pittman, found themselves out of work. They'd been designing memory chips for Mostech, a Texas semiconductor company, when their contract was abruptly canceled. Rather than look for new jobs, they decided to build their own company. They set up shop in the basement of a dental office in Boise and called it Micron Technology. Their plan was to design DRAM chips, dynamic random access memory, the basic building block of computer memory, more efficiently and cheaply than anyone else. They had no fabrication facility. They had no serious capital. What they had was Boise, which had 3 things going for it that Silicon Valley did not: cheap land, cheap electricity, and J.R. Simplot. Simplot was, by 1978, already one of the most extraordinary figures in American business. Born in 1909 in Iowa, he dropped out of school after 8th grade and moved to Idaho, where he built a potato empire that would eventually supply more than half of McDonald's French fries worldwide. The key innovation was freezing. Simplot's food chemists figured out that if you peeled, cut, blanched, and partially fried potatoes before flash freezing them, you got a product that could be shipped anywhere and cooked consistently in any restaurant kitchen. In 1967, Simplot and Ray Kroc, McDonald's founder, sealed the deal with a handshake. No contract, just a handshake between 2 men who understood commodities. By the late 1970s, Simplot was a billionaire, driving around Boise in a car with a license plate that read Spud. In 1980, Ward Parkinson introduced Simplot to Micron's founders and their pitch, a DRAM fabrication plant in Boise. Simplot knew nothing about semiconductors, but he recognized something in the DRAM market that looked familiar. Memory chips were a commodity, fungible, price-sensitive, sold on volume and cost efficiency. It was, in its essential structure, not so different from the potato business. The margins were thin, the competition was brutal, and the winner would be whoever could produce the most at the lowest cost. Simplot invested $1 million for a 40% stake in the company. That $1 million funded Micron's first fabrication plant, which broke ground in Boise in July 1980. By 1984, Micron had gone public, its shares priced at $13 apiece, and had introduced the world's smallest 256K DRAM chip. The company had something that would prove decisive over the next decade, a cost advantage rooted in Boise itself. Idaho's electricity was cheap, generated by the hydroelectric dams that Morrison Knudsen, among others, had built along the Snake River. Land was cheap. The cost of living was low enough that engineers' salaries went further. And the company's manufacturing processes, refined obsessively by a team that had something to prove, were among the most efficient in the world. They needed to be. In the mid-1980s, Japanese semiconductor manufacturers, heavily subsidized by their government, flooded the American market with DRAM chips priced below cost. It was a calculated strategy to destroy American competition, and it worked with devastating efficiency. Intel exited DRAM production. Motorola exited. Dozens of smaller firms went under. Micron nearly failed. By the mid-1980s, it was one of the last American DRAM manufacturers standing. And now the potato farmers stepped in again. J.R. Simplot was already carrying a personal grudge against Japan. Japanese tariffs on Idaho potatoes had been costing his company millions. When the semiconductor trade dispute escalated, Simplot went to Washington and personally lobbied President Ronald Reagan for protections against Japanese chip dumping. Whether Simplot's intervention was decisive is debatable. The entire American semiconductor industry was pushing for tariffs. But in 1986, the Reagan administration imposed anti-dumping duties on Japanese DRAM imports. Micron survived. The potato billionaire's grudge over French fry tariffs may have helped save the American memory chip industry. A 1995 Fortune cover story bore the headline, "Most of America Needed, the Simplot Saga, How America's French Fry King Made Billions More in Semiconductors." The New York Times ran, "From Mr. Spud to Mr. Chips." The irony was almost too neat. A man who'd made his fortune in the most ancient of agricultural products had bankrolled the most advanced sector of the American technology economy. And the whole thing had happened in Boise, Idaho, a city that most Americans, if they thought of it at all, associated with potatoes. Simplot died in May 2008 at the age of 99. His net worth at death was estimated at $3.7 billion. Had he held on to every share of his original Micron stake, his fortune would have been worth tens of billions more. He once said simply, "I started Micron Technology. I put the first $1 million in it and owned 40% of it, and it's been a howling success. We cover the world now. We will build the memory for the world. Period." He was right. As of 2025, Micron Technology employs about 53,000 people worldwide and generates $37.4 billion in annual revenue. It is the only major American manufacturer of computer memory, the last one standing from a field that once included dozens. In May 2026, Micron became the latest U.S. company to reach a $1 trillion market capitalization, driven by surging demand for its high-bandwidth memory chips used in artificial intelligence systems. The company's headquarters remain in Boise, on a campus that sprawls across the land where potato fields once grew. And beneath those headquarters, beneath the streets of downtown Boise, the hot water still flows. In 1983, the same period that HP was printing its way to dominance and Micron was fighting for survival against Japanese imports, the city of Boise drilled 4 new geothermal wells northeast of downtown and built a modern district heating system. Today, it is the largest municipally operated geothermal heating system in the United States and the 6th largest in the world. 92 buildings and more than 6 million square feet of downtown space. City Hall, the Convention Center, the YMCA, banks, hotels, Boise State University are heated by 170-degree water pumped from 3,000 feet underground. The total cost to heat all of it, roughly $1,000 per month. Not per building, total. The system runs on no fuel. It burns nothing. It draws hot water from a naturally heated aquifer, passes it through heat exchangers in each building, and re-injects the cooled water back underground to be reheated by the ancient batholith, the same buried rock that C.W. Moore tapped in 1892. The wooden pipes that Moore laid along Warm Springs are, according to local legend, still functioning. They never rot because the water never stops moving. Around 300 homes in the East End remain connected to that original 1890s pipeline. There is something about Boise that this fact captures better than any population statistic or revenue figure. The city has been, from the beginning, a place where the most important thing is underground, invisible, not obvious. The gold was in the mountains, not in the city. But the city was where the money got made. The railroad went to Nampa, but Boise became the capital anyway. The semiconductor industry was supposed to be in Silicon Valley, but the last American DRAM company was in Idaho. The energy that heats the city comes from beneath the streets themselves, from rock that cooled 70 million years ago. The population numbers, when you stand back and look at them, describe something close to a hockey stick. In 1920, 21,393. In 1960, 34,481. Barely any growth across 4 decades. Then, 1970, 74,990. 1980, 102,451. 1990, around 126,000. 2000, roughly 186,000. 2010, 206,000. 2020, 235,684. The Boise metropolitan area, which includes fast-growing suburbs like Meridian, Nampa, and Caldwell, reached 845,877 in the 2020 census. At various points in the 2000s and 2010s, it was the fastest-growing metro area in the nation. People were arriving from California, from Oregon, from Washington, drawn by the same basic equation that had drawn Ray Smellick in 1973. Affordable housing, outdoor recreation, clean air, and a job market increasingly anchored by technology firms. The accolades piled up in a way that would have mystified anyone who'd known the city in 1960. Forbes named Boise the second-best place to do business in America. USA Today declared Idaho's growth unstoppable. Magazines competed to call it one of the most inventive cities in the world. Housing prices inevitably climbed. By the early 2020s, the very affordability that had drawn the boom was being consumed by the boom itself. In 2022, Boise's population actually dipped slightly, by 1,387 people, as families priced out of the city proper moved to cheaper suburbs in Meridian and Nampa and Caldwell, the same satellite towns that had once been footnotes to Boise's story. Nampa, where the Oregon Short Line main line had run while Boise made do with a branch track, was now one of the fastest-growing cities in the nation. Morrison Knudsen did not survive to see all of this. The company that had built the Hoover Dam went bankrupt in 1996 after a disastrous period under CEO William Agee, whose attempts to diversify produced losses in the hundreds of millions. The headquarters building at Front and Broadway is still there. The company's name is gone. But the Idanha Hotel is still standing at the corner of 10th and Main. It has not been a hotel since the 1970s. It was converted to apartments. And the French chateau turrets now look down on a ground-floor donut shop and an Indian restaurant. The sandstone foundation, quarried from a Boise hillside, still holds. The elevator, the first in Idaho, still runs. If you stand on the sidewalk outside, you are 2 blocks from where the Stubline Depot once stood. You are standing above geothermal pipes. You are 5 miles from the Micron campus. You are in a city that has no natural right to be here. No harbor, no confluence of great rivers, no crossroads of trade routes. And that is, at this moment, home to one of the most strategically critical technology companies on Earth. The hot water runs at 177 degrees, a few thousand feet below Main Street, moving through rock that has been there since before the mountains themselves. It doesn't announce itself. There is no steam rising from manholes, no visible sign on the surface. You could walk the length of downtown Boise and never know it was there. But it is there, and it has been there for a very long time. And the city, improbably, impossibly, stubbornly, was built on top of it.